All right, hello and welcome everybody. I'm here with Mark Sunderland today from the Sunderland Group, and really excited that Mark's here to share some information with us. So thanks for being here, Mark. If you want to introduce yourself.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. Yes, Mark Sunderland, as he said. I'm the owner of the Sunderland Group here in Boulder. We're a small business accounting firm and business consulting firm, providing services, bookkeeping and accounting, tax preparation, tax planning, and business consulting services.
Yeah, absolutely. And today we are going to talk a little bit about business consulting. And with that, again, really appreciate you being here and all of your great insight and information. So business consulting, this is kind of a big topic that seems to come up with new business owners or small business owners or thinking about becoming incorporated or going from a sole proprietor, 1099 and so forth, right?
Sure.
So I guess my first question on that topic is, how do you help your clients identify what type of entity they should create, if
Sure.
that's the right term,
Sure.
for their business? And I got to imagine there's lots of different options between S Corp and C Corp and LLC and LLP
Sure.
and all that. So,
Yeah.
Anyway, why don't you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess even to back that up a step, it's when people are going to start a new business, no matter what it is, right? Whether they may not have even been a sole proprietor yet, they just decide, hey, I'm done working for the man. I want to be the man, and they want to start a business. So,
Yep.
my first advice is you should reach out to an accountant or an attorney before you do anything, because one thing we see more frequently than not is by the time they've come to us, they've already set up an entity. And then my first question is, well, why did you set that type of entity up? And they said, well, my neighbor told me to do it. Right?
That's the best answer. I hear that all the time.
Right? So, and not necessarily that they did the wrong thing. It's just they don't know why they did it, other than their neighbor told them to do it. So yeah, that's one of the things that we help consult on quite frequently, whether they've already set one up or not. Is, are they in the right entity? For what their goals are, right? And that's really what it comes down to, is what are they trying to accomplish with their business? Do they just want to be a sole proprietor or mom and pop shop and operate as such, or do they want to be a little bit more formal with having sometimes people just like to have LLC or Inc. at the end of their business name because it might make them look a little bit more official, a little bit more formal. There's nothing wrong with that, right? As long as they know what that type of entity that they set up entails.
Sure.
Usually when we're talking to small business owners, there's usually two types of entities that are probably the most common these days, and that's the LLC, which is a limited liability company, not a limited liability corporation, which is sometimes mistaken, or an S corporation. Okay, those are probably the two most popular. Probably the third is a partnership.
Okay.
Partnerships, at least from a legal standpoint, aren't as common as they used to be because the LLC has become much more popular.
And when you say partnership, by the way, is that an LLP or is that just a straight partnership?
Just a straight partnership. So if you and me decide to, hey, we want to start a business together, even if we don't draw up any documentation, by default we have created a partnership.
Fair enough.
It doesn't even have to be any legal documentation set up there. But now when we talk about these things, we're going to talk primarily at first about the legal entity, and then we'll also talk about what does that mean from a tax perspective, because they are relatively mutually exclusive, although there's a lot of similarities there, and that's where it gets a little bit complicated. To give you some perspective, LLCs, again, limited liability companies, they are a legal entity only. They are not. There's no such thing as an LLC as a tax entity. Where it gets confusing is S corporations and C corporations and partnerships. They are legal entities, but they also have a directly associated taxable entity as well. In other words, if you wanted to go look up how does an S corp get taxed, you're going to find tax codes on that topic. Same thing with a C corp. Same thing with a partnership. You will not find anything that says how is an LLC taxed, because LLCs do not exist within the IRS tax code.
Interesting. So are you saying effectively that with an LLC, limited liability company, if you and I were to have one together, that there's no tax code, there's no tax liability for that LLC because we are personally, individually liable for the taxes, not the company?
Well, sort of. That's kind of getting a little ahead here, but we'll get to that. What it means is the IRS says, I don't care that you're an LLC. All I care about is how many members, which are basically the term they give LLCs, the LLC owners.
Okay.
They just say how many owners are there, and based on that answer will determine how you're viewed by the IRS. So if you set up an LLC by yourself and you're the only owner or the only member, you will be considered a sole proprietor, which is kind of like a mom and pop, right? The sole proprietor for tax purposes. which just becomes a separate schedule and as part of your personal tax return.
Okay.
If you and me set up an LLC to go in the business together, now by default we have become a partnership for tax purposes, and we will file a separate tax return.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay, but an individual creating an LLC, maybe with their spouse or individually, or did I just complicate it again with a spouse?
Well, no, if they do a spouse, then they've by default created a partnership.
So that is a partnership. Anytime
Correct.
there's more than one individual in an
Correct.
LLC, you have a partnership.
Yep, that's correct.
But an individual who owns an LLC, and I think the most common, so maybe we can use this, is somebody buys a rental property,
Sure.
right? I
Yeah.
hear that again often in my business, where someone wants to buy a rental property and they want to put the title of the property into an LLC to protect them from what? Liability,
Correct.
right? So from that standpoint, talk to me about the taxes,
Yep.
if you will, on
Yeah.
that particular situation maybe.
Right. Well, and you hit on a good point that I probably should have mentioned earlier. I mean, when we're talking about what type of entity somebody should be, one of the reasons they want to be a legal entity of any sort is usually for liability purposes. Once you create a legal entity, that business or that rental property, for example, is a separate entity from you as an individual. Even though you might be the only owner, right? That entity is a separate entity in and of itself, which is where the liability protection comes in. Which is why it's so common for people wanting to put rental properties into an LLC to kind of shield the liability of that property from their personal assets. For example, their primary residence, their investment accounts, and all that stuff. They don't want something that could drastically go wrong in that rental property. Let's say and get sued, and then their umbrella coverage and their homeowner's insurance doesn't cover it. They don't want them to be all those people, those suing them, to be able to come after personal assets. So that's the primary reason a lot of business owners and rental owners will want to create a separate legal entity to put the business in or the rental property in. Now, from a tax perspective, all the legal entities that we generally look at or talk about are going to be what we consider, pass-through entities. Pass-through entities. And what that means is, I think that was to your question, was where does the tax liability reside? The entity itself may have a filing requirement, but the actual tax, where the tax is going to get applied, is to the individual owners.
Got it.
Okay? So again, back to your question, you put a rental property in an LLC. If you're the only owner of that LLC, it's just going to get reported on your personal tax return. Similar to if you had an operating business that was an LLC, that's also just going to be taxed directly on your tax return. If you and me buy a rental property within an LLC, like I said earlier, we will file a partnership tax return. It's an informational return only. The partnership will not pay any taxes.
Got it. But
you and I individually will get our respective share of the income and expenses of that partnership or that LLC, and we'll report that on our personal tax return, and that's where it'll get taxed.
Got it. So in other words, you've mentioned this term to me before in other conversations, is a pass-through entity? Is that what you're saying from a tax standpoint? That's
correct. So what I mean by that is that the entity itself may have a filing requirement, but the tax liability will be passed through to the individual owners. The one exception is a C corporation, which we don't see very often, and the reason for that is, without getting too detailed, is C corporations get what we call double taxed. Excuse me. The double tax happens because that entity itself does pay taxes on its profits, and then if it pays out those profits in the way of dividends to its shareholders, the shareholders again pay tax on those dividends. So then you might say, well, why would anybody want to be a C corp? Well, there are many reasons. I mean, if you want to be, depending on what types of investors or outside investors you want to have in, maybe the number of shareholders you want to have be part of your company. If you want international investors, that type of thing, those are many of the reasons why you would have to be a C corporation, even though you have to deal with the double taxation issue.
Got it. So clearly there's a lot of information and a lot of assessment that needs to go into understanding what's the best entity structure for any particular business, small business owner, or even for somebody who owns rental property.
Right.
Before we wrap up, maybe you can address quickly, and again, forgive me, maybe it's not quick, but what are the biggest pitfalls you see with people starting up a business outside of entity selection that maybe you can speak to really quickly?
Yeah, I would say, most people go into business, they want to be a business owner. Our experience and why so many small businesses fail, I think the numbers are, 50% within the first 5 years fail, and then 80% within the first 7 or 10 years, I can't remember the exact numbers, do fail. And what I think the primary, there's all kinds of causes, but I think what really happens is somebody starts a business and they are the business, right? They're not really a business owner. A real business owner doesn't have to be doing all the work, right? They don't have to be the bookkeeper. They shouldn't have to be the janitor. They should be outsourcing this stuff or hiring and training people to do that work. Otherwise, and that's why I think most small business owners fail, is they are doing all that, right or wrong, right? And a lot of times it's because down to finance. They're like, well, I have to do it because I can't afford to hire somebody else to do it. Well, then they get stuck in that rut and they never get out of it. So that's
Sure.
where we see the biggest mistakes happen with small business owners is they're not really a business owner. They're just what we call a technician. They are doing what they do, and they're probably really good at what they do, but then they never train somebody else to do it, so they're always the one that has to do it.
Yeah, and I think I've heard you use this term before, but instead of being an entrepreneur, they're a solopreneur.
They're a solopreneur, yeah.
Solopreneur.
Yeah.
I mean, really, at the end of the day, they are the business, as you said. And I think what I heard you also say is, you have to, in order to scale the business, in order to grow the business, as a business owner, you have to focus on the business itself, right? Sales, marketing, and all of that outside activity that needs to be done versus working in the business every day. And I think that's a big distinction that you and I have talked about before with working in the business versus on the business.
Exactly right. And I'll mention 2 books that I highly recommend anybody going into business, even if they're starting a business or have been in business for 50 years, that I recommend them read. And I'm not the author, so I don't get any kickbacks for these. But one is the Emyth.
Emyth Revisited, I know.
The Emyth is it basically talks about this concept and really as a business owner trying to think of yourself as a franchise. Not that you'd want to franchise your business, some might, but most never want to go down that path.
Sure.
But if you think about the most successful franchises in our world, in our country, like McDonald's would be probably top of the list, maybe Starbucks. What they have done is they've built the systems and the processes so that they can basically plug anybody in and train them up so they make the hamburger here the same way they make a hamburger in Europe, for example, right? It works. Thinking of your business that same way right out of the gate, especially if you're a new business owner, I want to make sure that when I'm doing something, I'm building my systems and processes so that eventually when I have so much work, I can't do it all myself.
Right.
I can train somebody and give them the manual on how to do it. So that's one book I highly recommend people getting. And the other one is something called Profit First. That again, what's the other reason why so many small businesses fail is they're not profitable enough, right? So Profit First is a highly recommended book where it basically helps business owners establish a mechanism of making sure that they take profits before they think about anything else,
Smart.
including taxes, including their own pay, and including, and probably most importantly, their operating expenses, right? If you think about the traditional accounting formula, if you will, it's sales minus expenses gives you profit. Everybody hears the bottom line. Why is that last? Your profit, which is the bottom line, should be the first thing you think about.
Interesting.
Right? So Profit First kind of gets you in that methodology of thinking about, I want to take my profits out before I worry about paying my taxes or paying my vendors, right?
Interesting. Yeah.
So it's just an interesting concept that I highly recommend any business owner. Those 2 books have been very helpful for me in my career as well as helping advise some of our business clients.
Yeah, and I know you do advise a lot of business clients, so thank you for that. That's great insight. And one of the tips that I was taught early on in my career was also with a business coach that taught me time blocking. Yeah. And in that time blocking is putting time on my calendar for literally working on the business.
Right.
And I used to literally earmark time each week to do on time is what I called it on my calendar. And it was not working on loans. It was not necessarily talking to clients, but it was really big picture vision casting, right? Business planning, and growing the business and scaling the business. So I think that's a great point. Any last minute tips before we wrap up here today for anybody thinking about creating a business or new small business owners out
Not
there?
really. I guess I would just say, just kind of to summarize about everything we talked about, is make sure that if you want to go in, you want to start a business, that you have to make a decision. Do you want to be a business owner, or do you just want to work for yourself and be the technician all the time?
Yeah, and there's nothing wrong with that.
There's nothing wrong with that,
But
right?
you got to make that distinction.
They are much different methodologies.
Yeah.
So.
Awesome, Mark. Well, I appreciate your time. How can people get a hold of you if they want to
Probably easiest
follow up?
way is to go to our website, which is just sunderlandcpa.com.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thanks again, Mark.
All
Great
right.
to see you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right. Talk to you soon.